the central crisis of the Old Testament is the destruction of Jerusalem. As you know, Jerusalem was the temple. It was the place where the elite priests lived. It was the capital city for the king and his entourage. And it was the center of learning where the scribes operated. Those are the smart lawyers. So if you take the priests, the king, and the smart lawyers, you've pretty much got the urban elite. And the way the economy worked in that ancient Israel is that Jerusalem was surrounded by peasant farmers who lived at a subsistence level, but the economy was organized so that all the money flowed to the place where the elites lived, and the elites lived with great surplus wealth that was taken from the peasant farmers who barely got by. You don't have any trouble thinking about analogs if you think about the way the money flows to our central urban areas and the big banks and all of that financial community. When you have an elite living off of surplus wealth and you have subsistent farmers that are financing it, you have a circumstance of economic injustice. And the prophets of the 8th century and the 7th century continued to say that the Jerusalem economic arrangement simply could not be sustained. It could not be sustained because you cannot sustain that kind of economic injustice over time. And the way it turned out is that Jerusalem was destroyed. It was destroyed by the Babylonian Empire, but some people said it was destroyed by the wrath of God, who wouldn't put up with that kind of economic injustice. In any case, what happened is that the Babylonian conquerors of Jerusalem deported the elite leadership class. They did not deport all of the Israelites who were living there. They took away the elite, because if you take away the elite, you take away the energy for resistance. So that's what they did. Now, these texts that you have in your hand, they are two texts that are undoubtedly dated in the middle of the 6th century, and they reflect the opinion and the faith and the crisis of the elite who were deported. The main deportation was in 587 BCE, and by 540, that's a little less than 50 years, the geopolitics of that area began to indicate that Babylon would soon collapse in the face of Persia. Now, so that you get the geopolitics, Babylon is Iraq and Persia is Iran. So what they anticipated is that the government of Iran would soon overcome the government of Iraq, and that indeed is what was happening by 540. And they didn't know what was going to happen, but the main hope of the deported Jews is that the Persian Iranian government would permit them to go back home to Jerusalem. They longed for Jerusalem. And you may know that in the Hebrew Bible, the books are arranged in a different order, so that the very last book of the Hebrew Bible is 2nd Chronicles, and the last verses of 2nd Chronicles is a decree by Cyrus, the Persian king, who said that the Jews may go back home. It's worth noticing in passing that the Hebrew Bible ends, the ultimate promise is that the Jews get to go home. So that's the seed of Zionism. The ending of the Christian Old Testament, you know it's in Malachi, but you may not know what those last verses in Malachi are. They are an announcement that the ancient prophet of Elijah will come again. So what happens in the New Testament is that John the Baptist plays the role of Elijah, and then you remember that when Jesus said, "Who do you say that I am?" they said, some people think you're Elijah, come back. So the ending of the Hebrew Bible or the Christian Old Testament are very different kinds of hopes. But the big hope for the Jews in Babylon was that they could get to go back home. Now, I want you to look at these two texts that you have in your hand. The first text that I want to look at is the one in Isaiah 43. And you may know that if you're up to critical snuff, that the middle chapters of Isaiah are called Second Isaiah because it's later than the first bunch of chapters. And the common assumption is that these middle chapters come from the 6th century and are addressed to the elite Jews who were deported to Babylon. We're familiar with this part of Isaiah because Handel's Messiah comes almost completely from this part of Isaiah, and what Handel obviously did was to reinterpret it all in Christian categories, but first we'll try to take it the other way. So if you look at this text, Isaiah 43, what you have is an introductory formula in verse 14 and verse 16, "Thus says the Lord," so that the poet is saying, these are not my words, they are words that have been given to me, and you better listen up. They are the words, verse 14, they are the words of the Redeemer, the Holy One of Israel, Yahweh, who will, and you may know that Hebrew poetry basically works by parallelism. That means it says something, and then the next line says it another way. And that takes great artistry to find a second way. That very often is why preachers are so repetitious. They're engaging in Hebrew poetic parallelism, and they're saying the same thing twice. So the one who gives the word is the one who will break down all the bars. That doesn't mean the taverns. That means the walls of defense. And then the parallelism is that the Chaldeans, that's another word for the Babylonians, they'll all be reduced to crying and complaining and sadness because the city of Babylon is going to be destroyed. And then verse 15 simply seals that by reminding them that the one who speaks this is the Creator of Israel, your King. Then the poet starts again, "Thus says the Lord." So in verse 14, this is the God who will destroy Babylon. In verse 16, this is the God. And then you see the parallelism, who makes a way in the sea, who makes a path in the mighty waters. That's parallelism. Who brings out the chariot and the horse. That's parallelism, army and warrior. The horse and the chariot and the army and the warrior, they lie down. Then you have verse 4 parallels. They lie down, they cannot rise, they are extinguished, they are quenched like a wick. Verses 16 and 17 are a remembrance of the ancient Exodus. It is in the Exodus that this powerful God made a way in the waters, and the horse and the chariot and the army and the warrior are the Pharaoh's army that were all drowned and disappeared and got rid of. So verses 14 and 15 anticipates the destruction of Jerusalem. Verses 16 and 17 remembers the destruction of Pharaoh. But what I want you to really see is verse 18. Do not remember the Exodus. Do not talk about old things. It would be like saying to Christians, do not remember the historical Jesus. Forget about him. Because God says, I am doing a new thing. So the tension is, if you spend your energy remembering what was, you will not notice what's about to happen. And what's about to happen is a new thing, and then the poet says in disbelief, can't you see it? Can't you see what's new? And what's new is that I will make a way in the desert of Babylon I will make rivers in the desert. I will give so much water in that arid climate that wild animals and jackals and ostriches, they will all get water and they will all praise me. They will thank me because I am the Creator who gives water in arid land. That's a good word for Texas. And so I will give water to them, and then I will give drink to my chosen people, Israel. So what I want you to notice, the dynamism of this text is to forget old things and to notice the new thing. The new thing is that God is going to invert the historical process and make it possible for the chosen people of Israel to rejoice. But the implication is, if you spend all your energy looking back, you're not going to see what's forward. Now, I want you to look at the backside. This psalm is interesting on two counts. The first count is it is the only psalm that we are able to date. So he says, by the canals of Babylon, we, that is the elite Jews, had been deported. We sat down and cried. So we can date this psalm to the 50-year period of the deportation. We cannot date any other psalm with such confidence. The other thing that's noteworthy and makes this psalm notorious is that it ends in violence. These are some of the most embarrassing words in the Old Testament. "O daughter by the hated Babylon, you devastator, happy or lucky will they be who retaliate to you for what you have done to us. Lucky will they be who take little Babylonian babies and smash their heads against the rocks. That'll be very lucky." The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. I grew up in a rural church, and we had a very bad choir. We didn't have paid singers. And I can remember that Psalm 137 came up about every 3 years. And I can remember the soprano saying, dash their head, paying no attention to what was being said. So, let's go back to the top. By the canals of Babylon, we wept. We wept because we remembered Jerusalem, Zion. And we wanted to sing the songs of Zion. It's probable that the songs of Zion is a technical term for certain psalms in the book of Psalms that celebrate Jerusalem. The best known of those is Psalm 46, which is a song of Zion. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in time of trouble. Therefore we will not fear though the earth disintegrate, and all of that. Or Psalm 84, which some of you in the choir will know from Brahms, how lovely are thy dwelling places. And it talks about the temple being a hospitable place where birds can build their nests and all that kind of stuff. And our Babylonian tormentors made fun of us by asking us to sing the songs of Zion so that we could see that the songs of Zion are simply not true. It is not true that God is our refuge and help in a very time of trouble and all blah, 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 blah. So then they say with indignation, how can we sing such psalms? See, they knew they were supposed to sing. These songs have to be sung in Jerusalem. We can't sing them in Babylon where we have been deported. And then you get this almost oath. I swear to God, if I forget Jerusalem, let my right hand wither, let really bad things, I am never going to forget Jerusalem. Now, what you have to notice is that the people that are singing this are the privileged elites from Babylon who remember a Jerusalem that didn't exist. They over-remember the good old days, because we know that we know from the prophets, Jerusalem was a place of exploitation and greed and injustice. They don't remember that. What they remember is their privilege and their wealth and how well off they were. They didn't notice the other stuff. So we will remember that, and we will resent forever that it's been taken from us. I think this is a psalm of nostalgia that over-remembers. So I thought, by putting these two texts back to back, that if you engage in too much nostalgia for the way it used to be, you will not be able to notice what God is doing now on your behalf. And if you over-remember the way it used to be, the last two verses suggest to me that if you over-remember, you will want to commit violence against people who have taken that away from you. So they hated the Babylonians because they lost their privilege and their entitlement and their surplus wealth. They didn't entertain the thought that they lost it because of injustice. They lost it because of the goddamn Babylonians. And therefore, I hope they all get killed. So, see if you think I overread. People who have nostalgia and over-remember the good old days are going to be inclined toward violence toward those who are taking it from them. And our preoccupation with recovering the way it used to be causes us not to notice the new things that God is working among us. That seems to me to be a fair read of the text. Where we get into problems is we ask, what's that text mean now? You always have to make that move to contemporaneity. So I'll make that move, and then I'll give you a chance to speak and see what you think. I think that we now live, we in the United States, live in a political world in which those who have been most privileged and most entitled and had the most surplus wealth are over-remembering how wonderful it was, because when we enjoyed our surplus wealth, we didn't have to pay great attention to the subsistence class that provided cheap labor to make that surplus wealth possible. And I am struck, I don't know how many of you might subscribe to Donald Trump's campaign. I think that Donald Trump's campaign is indeed an invitation when he says, take our country back. It is to recover that particular slice of well-being for that particular slice of people. And that movement, at least rhetorically, lives at the edge of violence toward those who are taking it from us. So the question is, I think the question is, what are we not supposed to remember now? And my candidates would be, we're not supposed to remember unquestioned white entitlement. We're not supposed to remember being the last superpower that could have our way everywhere in the world. Those are my candidates. You may have other candidates. And the other question is, what is God doing new that we don't notice if we are preoccupied with trying to take back our country the way it used to be? I think God is bringing a new multicultural society that is a shock to many of us who lived in all-white neighborhoods or whatever. I think, see what you think about this. I think that God is bringing a new ecumenism in which we learn to articulate our faith alongside faithful Jews and faithful Muslims to discover that our common faith is a great force for societal well-being against the Muslim nuts and against the Jewish nuts and against the Christian nuts. And I think that does not require us to give up our Christian confession, but it requires us to make our Christian confession differently in the presence of other people. Because you know, if it happened in your workplace, what happened when the first woman got to the table or the first black got to the table, the conversation sort of had to shift. You couldn't keep saying things the way you said them. So I think we are now in an ecumenical moment when we have to learn in really demanding ways how to articulate our Christian confession in a new ecumenism that, according to the old formulations, really sounds maybe like heresy. Now, we've got some time for you to respond to this, but what I want to say is that the two big questions that I think these texts provide is, on the one hand, what are we over-remembering that we need to relinquish? And you don't have to take my candidates. And what is God doing new among us that we run the risk of not noticing because of our over-remembering? I want to say a little footnote in passing, and then I'll stop, that this business of prosperous Jerusalem, destroyed Jerusalem, and the possibility of New Jerusalem is exactly the dramatic core of the New Testament, in which you had the ministry of Jesus, the death of Jesus, and the resurrection of Jesus to new life. It is the same pattern, so as N.T. Wright is teaching everywhere, the New Testament is essentially a reperformance of the dramatic flow of the Old Testament. And my judgment is that those of us who confess Christ now have the chance in our time to reiterate that same drama of loss and anguish and hope for what God is doing. And any of you that have been in psychotherapy have maybe been through the same drama, in which you discovered in psychotherapy that as long as you hold on to the way the old self was, you cannot become a new self. And I think that's probably the truth of these texts. So let me stop there. I think I put something on the table that we could have a discussion about if we wanted to. So question or comment? Yes?
You open the door to this question. You keep saying your candidates. Who are your candidates?
By my candidates, I meant my nominations are what we have not to yearn for
Oh, no, I'm
are
talking
white.
about presidential.
Oh, well, I will vote for anybody who is for taking care of vulnerable people and who believes in diplomacy rather than military action first. You can figure out who that might be. Yes.
With history in mind, as being a forecast of the future, how many generations is it going to take to
Well,
make this happen?
For the newness to come, the question is, given historical learnings, how many generations will it take for this to happen? My sense as an old man is that things happen much more quickly now than they have in the past. Who would have thought that we would have had such a altered opinion about gays and lesbians? It happened, for some people it didn't happen quickly enough, but for many people it happened very, very quickly. I think we're going to see a speed up of multiculturalism, and those who do not move into multiculturalism, like North Carolina, they're going to be left behind. They're going to be left behind economically and in every other way. And what I would say for people of faith, how quickly that happens doesn't matter. Our work is to be alertly receiving, because as you know, 1,000 days are like an evening spent. So I think quickly in the sight of God, in the twinkling of an eye.
Okay, what is the twinkling of an eye, or the
Well, we'll have to.
generational sense?
I think my grandchildren already are living in a world that I do not recognize. See, if you talk to my grandchildren about the gay lesbian problem, they say, what's the problem here? I don't have any problem with that, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, you know, I have no way of knowing, but to answer your question, 2 generations. And if you look at the church, it wouldn't be true at St. Michael's, but many churches are struggling with dollars and members, and they go around looking for a pastor or a priest who can perform magic and make it the way it used to be. It ain't gonna be the way it used to be. God is doing a new thing, and God is always out in front of us, shocking us with gospel newness, I think.
Let's take one more question. We have time for one more question before Bob Johnson has a heart attack.
So the question, I think, is what do you think the government, or what we think the government ought to do? So it seems like they say about Donald Trump that he's really not so much talking about the elite, but he's really talking to the angry, frustrated, scared middle class.
That's correct.
So I think most people think the elite will get taken care of the next election. It doesn't matter who gets elected. So if the government is supposed to be the instrument of equality, then what kind of candidate are we supposed to vote for? You don't have to name names unless you want to.
No, I'm not going to name names. I think that our government has largely been purchased, both parties, and I think Bernie is right about democratically taking back the government from moneyed interests in order that we can have a different kind of budget and different kind of policies that take account of the whole people. I understand it's very complex. I'm not stupid about that. It should become neighborly. The church is in the neighborly business. And that applies to political structure and political policy. But neighborliness always means, does it not, curbing some practices of privilege and entitlement from some. And I think that's what we face.
And if that doesn't make you want to come back after the next service, I don't know what will.